This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. The iPlayer is the BBC's pride and joy, but last week it became the no player. Why did it crash, and why were so many listeners left in the dark about what was happening?
Really, I'm a bit disappointed that the number one communication media organisation in the world got the communication so badly in this case.
And was this week's moral maze ruined by what one listener called intemperate personalities and weak chairmanship?
Witnesses were not allowed to make their points without being heckled, hectored, talked over, shouted down, cut short. In the end, it was a pointless row on air.
And what makes for a successful radio double act? We get the inside track from the unlikely combination of an elderly opening batsman and a middle-aged fast bowler. Boycott and Aggers.
I'm leading you along, Jeffrey, you see. That's the point. I make you good.
You're leading me astray, are you?
I make you good. I toss you the questions.
He makes me good. Can you believe it?
And you answer the questions, see. But you're the strong. You're the forthright one.
More from Sir Geoffrey and young Jonathan later. But first, a lost weekend. Last Saturday morning, like many of you, I was looking forward to catching up on all the radio I'd missed during the week, using the BBC iPlayer. There was Friday's edition of The Archers to catch up on, before the new Sunday episode. I'm really worried about Helen. She sounds so trusting, but Rob is bad news. She really should get shot of him.
Let's not leave the lamb any longer.
No, not until you've rung them.
Oh, come on.
Rob, I'm serious. I'm worried even if you aren't.
Look, we can still have an enjoyable...
Rob's parents were mysteriously late, without explanation. And so was that episode of The Archers, as were a host of other radio and TV programmes that many of you were desperate to catch up on, using BBC iPlayer. Many of us were jumping up and down with frustration after having found this message displayed on BBC iPlayer.
This content doesn't seem to be working. Please try again later.
Later? Next week, next month, next year? It was as irritating as an answer phone. Listener Roger, not me this time, was one of the first to get in touch with feedback on Saturday morning.
Last weekend, I suddenly found that The Archers was not available on Listen Again. So then, of course, I then went on the internet and tried to search for what had happened. But on the BBC itself, I couldn't find anything. Why aren't they telling us? So I guess really I'm a bit disappointed that the number one communication media organisation in the world got the communication so badly in this case.
Catch-up on BBC iPlayer remained out of action for many of you for most of the weekend, and lots of listeners wrote to us to say that they felt the BBC compounded the problem by not letting people know what was going on.
I'm Tim Oxton from Colchester in Essex. On Saturday, I tried to hear the previous Saturday's jazz record requests, and it didn't work. I got a message saying, "This is not working, try again later." The message which appears on such an occasion should be clearer. It ought to specify that we are having problems, don't bother again until Monday morning.
My name is Sandra Miles-Taylor. How marvellous of the BBC to finally let us know via Twitter of the iPlayer issues that started on Saturday. I do not tweet, probably like many others, so I had no idea that the issue lay with the BBC. Only 36 hours later did you finally admit issues on the BBC News page.
Hello, I'm David Bracey from Essex. Would it not be possible for the BBC to get off automatic pilot and use live broadcasting to keep us up to date, apologise and explain what's happening?
Just some of the many listeners who got in touch with us. Most of the problems were resolved by Monday, and the BBC iPlayer has now resumed normal catch-up services. But what went wrong, and should the BBC have done more to keep listeners informed? Mark Friend is the BBC's controller for radio multi-platforms and interactive.
Last weekend we had a really serious incident which impacted on BBC iPlayer, iPlayer Radio, the homepage, and in fact any video and audio clips we were publishing to the BBC. And about 9:30 in the morning on Saturday, the load on the database that serves all of the data to the websites started to go through the roof. So we had a lot more demand on those servers, and the immediate impact of that depended on how different bits of the BBC website are built. So what we saw at that point was some very different impacts. In some areas there was no impact at all, in some areas it was more serious.
And so why was the load suddenly increased?
We're looking at that now, so we're doing the forensics on that. I don't have a clear answer. There's a whole number of potentially contributory factors. What we've done since last weekend is stop some elements of the service which we think might be contributing to that. So we're trying to make it safer and less likely that this will recur.
Now, it coincided with the move to 30-day catch-up rather than 7. Do you think that was a contributory factor?
We don't know as yet. As I say, we're doing the forensic to find out exactly what the root cause was. From next week, we're going to withdraw 30 days again and go back to 7 days as a precautionary measure to ensure that the website stays stable. There are a number of other measures that we're taking to try and de-risk the situation.
Now, over the weekend, bits did start working again. I think the live online listening, you got that up quickly. But what happened? Why did it take so long? Did you think you were cracking it at one moment and then suddenly discovered you hadn't?
So we had the first failure at 9:30. We had a second type of failure soon after that.
This on Saturday?
This on Saturday. And so it became clearer by about midday that the problem was more serious than we'd first imagined. And at that point, there was a certain amount of communication beginning to happen.
Now, of course, in a situation like that, you've obviously got to alert people that there's something wrong. You can't say, when it'll be back on air if you don't know when it's back on air. But a lot of our listeners say, the BBC is the leading communications business in the world, and you couldn't communicate these problems. You chose Twitter, but you didn't use live Radio 4, for example, to tell people.
There was coordination, Roger, but there was not a decision to use live broadcast to broadcast the fact that there was a problem.
Should there have been?
We've had a number of audio problems in recent months. The technology is old. If we were to broadcast every time there is a problem with on-demand or live radio, you might be hearing it a lot. And the truth is, we didn't know at the time how long it would take to solve. And in fact, by Saturday night, we thought the issues had been solved. So it would have been very confusing when we had different experiences on different platforms. It was working okay on some platforms and not on others. So to do a generic broadcast would have been a very confusing thing, I think, at that stage.
Well, it depends what it said. If you simply said the BBC iPlayer is suffering significant problems, so we expect that these will be resolved shortly, but we can't be sure. So if you're having difficulty, don't worry, it's not your particular problem, it's a larger problem, and we'll communicate as soon as possible. I mean, if you did that, on live broadcasting, whatever, it would have a better chance of getting to people, a lot of people, than the use of Twitter.
If we had known at 9:30 on Saturday morning that the total sum of the problem would not be resolved until 1:15 on Monday afternoon, we might have done things differently.
What are the lessons now, do you think, for communication? If this sort of thing were to happen again, would you communicate with your audience differently?
We need to find a way on the websites to make sure that we can communicate, I think, more dynamically about what is exactly the situation right now. We were sending out some very generic messages through Saturday and Sunday saying it's broken and we're trying to fix it. I think we could be clearer about what platforms it's working on and what it's not. I think that's a lesson that we can take away from this.
Mark Friend, Controller of Radio and Music Multiplatform, thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger.
Now, Radio 4's The Moral Maze aims to unpick complex moral issues, combining acute analysis with robust live debate. It often leads to thrilling radio. But for many of you, this week's programme on Just War and Gaza had too much heat and too little light.
Hello, my name is Joe Stevenson. Witnesses were not allowed to make their points without being heckled, hectored, talked over, shouted down, cut short.
No, I'm asking you a question.
A very long question.
Please, could you answer my question?
I'm about to answer if you let me speak. 48 hours.
In the end, it was a pointless row on air.
You have not
You call it a
answered
rant,
my
I call your
question.
question a rant.
You have not answered my
Hello, my name's Andrew Dicker. This week's Moral Maze reached a new height of absurdity. Some of the witnesses seemed unable to articulate their beliefs.
If I were thought to support that, you wouldn't think that I ought to be in this high-level program.
I don't think you should be on this high-level program, but I think you're more...
The panel argued incoherently with the witnesses and each other, mainly about personal issues, which were not relevant to the moral discussion of what was a very sensitive subject.
Inclination, no sense that I shouldn't have been there.
This is complete garbage, Giles. Whatever your personal experience may have been.
Hello, my name is Ivor Hopkins. The topic is of international importance and needs to be discussed with cool heads. And yet the discussion on yesterday's programme was ruined by intemperate personalities and, unfortunately, by weak chairmanship.
Israelis do not deliberately kill civilians.
One at a time, please.
They do not
Chance.
deliberately kill civilians.
Well, I don't know.
That is the moral...
Such debates have to be done in a cool and guided manner, and it would be a great shame to see the moral maze fall foul of bad temper.
I put those concerns to the producer of The Moral Maze, Phil Peagam, and asked him first why he thought the Middle East conflict was a suitable topic for this week's programme.
It's an important subject that's really dominating the news, and there are important moral issues that come out of that about just war. And that's what we wanted to look at in the programme. We thought we could constructively add to the coverage that's already been quite extensively on air.
And in the end, do you think you did? Were you happy with the programme? Would you call it a success?
Yes, I think I was overall happy with the programme. I think it was a success. I recognise that your feedback listeners, some of them were unhappy with it. And I don't think it was perfect by any means, but I do think it added something extra to the coverage that has been on.
Well, you know, quite a lot of our listeners don't agree with you at all. Let me quote Dominic Waddington saying, rather than discussing this issue, most of what I heard was the panellists behaving like squabbling children. There was a lot of squabbling, wasn't there?
Gaza is an incredibly difficult and challenging issue to do, and we work really hard to make sure that we get a balanced approach.
No, this isn't so much about balance. It's people who want to hear the moral issues explored and discussed in a way they wouldn't hear elsewhere. They expect it from Moral Maze. They think they didn't get it.
Well, I was about to say a balanced approach, and one where we can allow people to express their passionately held views, and whether those are the panellists or the witnesses, and particularly on an issue like Gaza as well, which is inevitably emotional.
But you knew it was going to be emotional. Didn't you therefore say to your guest, please, and your panellists, let's keep the level down, let's make sure that the content and the dilemmas come forward, not the disagreements and the squabbling?
We have detailed, in-depth conversation with panellists and the witnesses before they go on air. And we talk through the programme and the issues that we want to come out and people's approaches to it. But it's a live programme, and Gaza is a particularly difficult and emotional issue. And sometimes, in a live programme, people are human. Their emotions do get the better of them. But the point is that this is what you heard on air. It's an honest exchange. This isn't a confection. This isn't people doing it for grandstanding. That is really a passionate exchange. And sometimes that happens. And the Moral Maze, Roger, is known for doing robust debate, and that's what it's there for. And
surely
we do
people
have
our
to
audience
try and
expects. Sorry, if I may interrupt now. Sorry, I don't want to copy the people in Moral Maze by behaving in the way they did in many ways. But the whole point about the Moral Maze is that it's very much admired by our listeners, but they do expect it to be a little different. They expect the moral issues to be identified, people given the time to explore them, and then challenged. And this is what people do not think they got in this edition.
We always take the feedback on board, and we're really interested in that. And to be honest, on a couple of occasions in this programme, I think I could have asked Michael to step in earlier. He did step in quite a lot, and that's his job. And he's extremely skilled and adept at handling these passionate issues. But what he's got to do is to allow people to express their passion, but to not let it get run away with them.
And he should have intervened a couple of more times.
I think perhaps on a couple of occasions, yes, I could have asked him to intervene earlier. But he was, if you listen back again, I have listened again after your listeners contacted you, and he was robust. He was actually controlling it.
Well, he had the most difficulty, and some of our listeners will not be surprised by this, with Melanie Phillips. Dominic Waddington said the most annoying part of the programme was listening to Melanie Phillips interrupting and shouting down other panellists and witnesses, such as their viewpoints could not be heard. She was the worst offender in that sense, in terms of interruption and not stopping and not obeying Michael's instructions, wasn't she?
I don't think she was the worst offender. I mean, she wasn't the only offender by any means.
But the worst.
Melanie Phillips is a passionate debater. I mean, that's why we have her on the programme. She's a passionate and powerful debater, but she's not the only person on the programme who is like that.
But you accept that sometimes she's so passionate and so emotional that she doesn't allow the person she's interrogating to fully express their opinion.
I think our panellists do a very good job, and sometimes their emotions get the better of them.
And so next time you do an issue like this, will you be saying to all the panellists, but including Melanie Phillips, make sure your interruptions don't interrupt the analysis of the moral complexities of the issues involved?
The panellists are there to examine the witnesses, and that's proper. They've got to ask the witnesses challenging questions. Now, they only have a very short amount of time to do that. So it's a difficult job for them to do. And if witnesses are deliberately trying to not answer the questions, well, naturally they want to push them on that, and that's their job. That's why you've been pushing and interrupting me during this discussion. And that's your job, and I accept that. And so that's what we want them to do.
I'll interrupt you no more. Thank you very much, Phil Peacom.
Thank you.
As ever, do let us know what you think about the moral maze, or indeed about anything to do with BBC Radio. You can write to feedback, PO Box 67234, London SE1P4AX, or leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can send an email to feedback@bbc.co.uk, or you can tweet us at BBCR4Feedback. All those details are on our website. And now your starter for 10. Can you identify this music, name the performers, and the much-loved radio programme whose signature tune it is? That is, of course, Soul Limbo by Booker T and the MGs, better known to all cricket lovers as the theme tune for Test Match Special. TMS is a broadcasting institution, although sometimes it seems to prefer talking about cakes to cricket. And everyone seems to have a nickname or append "ers" to their name, as in Johners and Blowers. In recent years, though, a new unlikely double act has delighted its many fans.
The match with the ball, maybe, next time.
I'd have been proud of.
Yeah, you would, Jeff. You only got it off the square. You talked about his...
Shut up, you.
You talked about his efforts. I mean,
Boyks and Aggers, Geoffrey Boycott and Jonathan Agnew. Their often spiky repartee has gained a cult following amongst cricket fans. And just before play started in the second test against India at Lord's last Saturday, our producer, Will Yates, fulfilled a lifetime's ambition by ascending to the TMS commentary box to ask them about their on- and off-air relationship.
Geoffrey and I actually go back to playing days anyway, so I think, to be fair, although he won't admit it, I think probably we had a healthy respect for each other then, actually. Opening bowler, opening batsman, he was old and past it by then anyway, so I got him out quite a lot.
And I still got runs off him all the time.
So I think, actually, for all the laughter and the mickey taking and the leg pulling, I think actually underneath it, there is a healthy respect, actually, for each other. And that's actually why the joshing can stand. If you didn't respect each other, then actually wouldn't get on as you do on the radio. And I think that's fair comment, Jeff.
Yeah, I think he's lucky, really, that he's found something that he's just good at.
Do you see yourselves as having different roles, Geoffrey? Do you see yourself as having a role of being opinionated? And Jonathan, do you see yourself as being...
No, I never think of a role.
Oh, I do, you see. I'm leading you along, Geoffrey, you see. That's the point. I make you good.
You're leading me astray, are you?
I make you good. I toss you the questions.
He makes me good. Can you believe it?
And you answer the questions, see. But you're the strong. You're the forthright one.
Well, I actually knew Ernie Wise. I met Eric Morecambe once or twice, but I knew he came from Kinsley. And actually, you think about it, we all loved Eric, who made you laugh. But actually, Ernie was a good part of that because he asked the right questions.
So which are you?
I'm not sure.
But certainly not the good laugh.
But I mean, it's important when there is a twosome that you get proper questions at the right time, or you get something right, and it works because you don't plan it.
I might have it. There's occasionally I've been told a Geoffrey story that I tuck away, or I've been lying in the bath or on the lawnmower and I think of something. Oh, hang on, I might just slip that past Geoffrey. No, it'd be something to surprise him. The lovely thing is that Geoffrey doesn't spend much time in here during the day. He's doing his telework, so I know what time he's coming on. I've seen the rotor, which is beside me here. I know he's coming on in 5 minutes. It gives me 5 minutes to dig a bit of a bear trap. You'll hear the door open. Oh, get the rubbish off. And in comes Geoffrey, and he doesn't know that I've just planted this little bomb. Geoffrey will admit that suffering from cancer and getting married and his daughter has changed the old boy a bit. He has softened, I think, since those cricketing days.
I've got 2 girls. I'll let you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Girls do.
Yeah. So he has.
But it is different. When you're playing, you're so focused, I was. And when you're not playing cricket, when you're not batting, there's another life, isn't there? There's another you. My friends always saw that, but very few other people did. They only saw me batting. People can't believe that I like Katy Perry, and I went to see her. They're amazed, aren't they? They don't believe I've been into feng shui, Rachel and I. The house, everything. And the Chinese feng shui, I have a master come every year. He's brilliant.
Okay, final question. A lot of weather about today. Is this the sort of day you look forward to, the fact that you're likely to be doing a lot of talking?
Yeah, I mean, today will be a challenge, I suspect, and he'll be popping in there. Although, actually, he tends to do a bit of a runner. When there's a lot of talking to be done in bad weather, you try and find Geoffrey Boycott, and he'll mysteriously have slipped away because it's all hands on deck. But we'll find him, we'll dig him out. But it'll be talk today, and that's a challenge, yeah.
I think radio, you do need to be able to talk about the history of the game, stories, incidents that happened when you were playing, because, well, you have to set the scene for everybody. They can't see anything at home. It's totally opposite from television. They see everything, and somebody talks too much. They say, oh, shut up a minute, I can see it, or give me something that I don't see. Radio, you have to fill in everything, and it's fun, that.
Our thanks to Mr. Jonathan and to Sir Geoffrey for putting up with my star-struck producer. Now, on Monday, the BBC published its annual report, the details of which were hardly reported, since at the press conference to launch it, Tony Hall, the Director-General, announced that Evan Davis was moving from Today to Newsnight in the autumn. I am sure that was a coincidence and was not intended to mask the fact that viewing and listening figures were dropping a bit, particularly amongst young people. The DG, however, was upbeat.
I think in this year we've had a really good year. When you think about it, people are still spending 18.5 hours a week with us, and all for 40 pence. Because we've had amazing programmes, from Happy Valley to the extraordinary events at Centre Court when Murray made his famous victory there, to Radio 1 Big Weekend, which nobody else does, to an extraordinary proms season, through to Grayson Perry delivering an amazing Wreath lecture. There have been so many things in the last year that the BBC and the people who, our audiences who use the BBC, should be immensely proud of, and indeed are.
Naturally, I would have liked to examine that claim in more detail, via the time-honoured method of an interview, if not with the DG himself, then with another senior member of the BBC executive, say the Director of Radio. After all, if the BBC were a publicly quoted company with shareholders, any of you could go to the AGM and ask questions of the executives and the board. I think it's called accountability. Alas, dear listener, no member of the executive was available to talk to us. Nor was Diane Coyle, the acting chairman of the BBC Trust. It's a pity that no one would talk directly to feedback about the report, as there was much that strikes a chord with the listeners. The BBC Trust reported that its audience councils were concerned at the apparent south-east bias of the BBC's coverage, particularly that of Radio 4. Frank Sudlow from Northampton shares that concern.
I find it a crazy idea that Women's Hour is moving from Salford back to London. After 3 or more hours of news from London, it's always refreshing when, at the end of the week, Women's Hour reminds us that there are places and voices outside of London. I find that Radio 4 is rapidly becoming Radio London.
Hi, I'm Jill Stubbs from Burnley in Lancashire. I'm getting increasingly fed up by the patronising approach of Radio 4 and the BBC in general relating to the Glasgow Games. It seems impossible for journalists to report on this without mentioning the London Olympics and how difficult it'll be to match the success of that event. It just serves to confirm the London-centric bias and attitude of the BBC as a whole, and its condescension to those outside the capital.
Hardly a new accusation, but what exactly is being done to address it? The BBC told us, via a statement, naturally,
The BBC has an obligation to serve all licence fee payers, and so we're working hard to represent our audiences through the broad range of programmes we offer and the way in which they're made. For example, the BBC is ahead of schedule in achieving its out-of-London targets, with 52.5% of programming produced outside the capital in 2013 and 2014, against a target of 50%, and 19.9% in the nations, against a target of 17%. Radio 4's approach will be much the same as the rest of the BBC.
In the annual report, the Trust also gave the BBC executive a priority for the coming year of making measurable progress in reflecting the diversity of the UK in the BBC's workforce, including increasing the number of women on air. All this just weeks after Radio 5 Live replaced two high-profile female presenters with men. How does the BBC square that circle?
When the new BBC Radio 5 Live schedule is launched in October, the station will have more female presenters in its regular lineup than at any time in the station's history. Overall, the schedule changes will mean that the number of female presenters on 5 Live will increase from 7 to 11. 3 out of 7 of the network's daytime presenters will be female: Rachel Burden, Sarah Brett and Anna Foster.
And, of course, there were other questions about why radio listening hours and audience appreciation were both down this year. But they will have to remain unanswered for the moment. Now, an announcement, or rather an acknowledgement.
Anything at all?
I don't want to talk about that.
Right.
Not over breakfast.
You'll just bottle it all
Not
up.
with a hangover.
Like everyone else.
Actually, not ever.
Like
right?
Dewhurst.
2 weeks ago, in our item on eating on the radio, we mentioned the Twitter hashtag #EatyTalkie, where listeners log instances of over-enthusiastic munching and chewing in programmes like The Archers. This led the person who coined that phrase to tweet a photo of a handwritten letter to us asking for public recognition of her neologism. We happily oblige.
Dear BBC Radio 4 feedback, I coined the hashtag #EatyTalkie in relation to repetitive noisy eating by a character on The Archers. You've now mentioned the hashtag liberally on 2 of your shows, and I should appreciate credit by name, please. Love, @Andron P.
Thank you, Andron P. Don't think that's her real name, but you never know. Now, before we go, just time to tell you that next week I'm going to be up in the Lake District. On a boat on Lake Windermere, to be precise, the rather unlikely-sounding venue for a recording of that hardy perennial Gardener's Question Time. I'll be reunited with my old school friend Eric Robson, who made a very convincing woman in a Carlisle Grammar School production of Murder in the Cathedral. Such pink cheeks and ruby red lips. I was pale by comparison. But why is Eric gardening on a boat? I shall try and find out, and the fruits of my labours will be on feedback next week. Goodbye. On using BBC iPlayer. Many of us were jumping up and down with frustration after having found this message displayed on BBC iPlayer.
This content doesn't seem to be working. Please try again later.
Later? Next week? Next month? Next year? It was as irritating as an answer phone. Listener Roger, not me this time, was one of the first to get in touch with feedback on Saturday morning.
Last weekend, I suddenly found that The Archers was not available on Listen Again. So then, of course, I then went on the internet and tried to search for what had happened, but on the BBC itself, I couldn't find anything. Why aren't they telling us? So I guess really I'm a bit disappointed that the number one communication media organisation in the world got the communication so badly in this case.
Catch-up on BBC iPlayer remained out of action for many of you for most of the weekend, and lots of listeners wrote to us to say that they felt the BBC compounded the problem by not letting people know what was going on.
I'm Tim Oxton from Colchester in Essex. On Saturday, I tried to hear the previous Saturday's jazz record requests, and it didn't work. I got a message saying, "This is not working, try again later." The message...
Their points without being heckled, hectored, talked over, shouted down, cut short. In the end, it was a pointless row on air.
And what makes for a successful radio double act? We get the inside track from the unlikely combination of an elderly opening batsman and a middle-aged fast bowler. Boycott and Aggers.
I'm leading you along, Jeffrey, see? That's the point. I make you good.
You're leading me astray, are you?
I make you good. I toss you the
He
questions.
makes me good. Can you believe it?
And you answer the questions, see? But you're the strong. You're the forthright one.
More from Sir Geoffrey and young Jonathan later. But first, a lost weekend. Last Saturday morning, like many of you, I was looking forward to catching up on all the radio I'd missed during the week, using the BBC iPlayer. There was Friday's edition of The Archers to catch up on, before the new Sunday episode. I'm really worried about Helen. She sounds so trusting, but Rob is bad news. She really should get shot of him.
Let's not leave the lamb any longer.
No, not until you've rung them.
Come on.
Rob, I'm serious. I'm worried even if you aren't.
Look, we can still have an enjoyable...
Rob's parents were mysteriously late, without explanation. And so was that episode of The Archers, as were a host of other radio and TV programmes that many of you were desperate to catch up on. This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. The iPlayer is the BBC's pride and joy, but last week it became the no player. Why did it crash, and why were so many listeners left in the dark about what was happening?
Really, I'm a bit disappointed that the number one communication media organisation in the world got the communication so badly in this case.
And was this week's moral maze ruined by what one listener called intemperate personalities and weak chairmanship?
Witnesses were not allowed to make